Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go.
For much of the world, darkness is an ever-present reality. False religions blind the eyes of countless millions. Hindus seek to appease an endless number of gods, striving to one day break the cycle of death and rebirth. Burning incense and spinning prayer wheels, Buddhists attempt to earn merit for a better life to come. Muslims bow faithfully to Allah 5 times a day, hoping that their good deeds will ultimately outweigh the bad. Most of these seekers have never met a Christian, seen a Bible, or heard the gospel message. They are the unreached peoples of the earth. The vast majority of these unreached peoples live in an area known as the 1040 window, a rectangle that spans from 10 degrees to 40 degrees north of the equator and stretches from the plains of Morocco to the shores of Taiwan. Home to more than half of the Earth's population, this area contains over 95% of the world's least evangelized people. Hundreds of mission agencies, denominations, and organizations worldwide have united behind the vision of the AD 2000 and beyond movement. Their common purpose is to see a church for every people and the gospel for every person by the year 2000.
The video that we've just seen is an introduction to the subject for this evening, community and community resources and understanding social space. And why did I use that video? Well, the most important reason is that every group of people that you saw in there, every unreached people group in the world, live in some kind of community. And if we're going to reach unreached peoples, if we're going to target those people for the gospel, we need to know something about their communities. The nature of community, the structure of community, the values and commitments of community are probably some of the most important issues that you will face as you go to reach people for the Lord Jesus Christ. As we think then about the task of world evangelism, and we think about the 600 unreached people groups at this time who have not yet been reached, as we think about those groups that are where people are working but they are really struggling in terms of reaching people. We think about people in our own communities, in our own cities around us. We're always looking at people that are in some way or another associated with community. Tonight we're going to be looking at urban communities, we're going to be looking at rural communities. We're going to be trying to understand how people cooperate together in communities, and we're going to look to see how we can best understand the characteristics of community itself. But before we get into that, I think the most important thing to realize is that our whole purpose in this research is to understand people so that we can bring to them a message that is a message of transformation, a message that will bring them into a relationship with God. The message of the gospel is God in Christ reconciling the world to himself. As we bring that message of reconciliation, there are all kinds of barriers, such as have been noted in this particular video, to people coming to Christ. There is the barrier of their religious beliefs. There is the barrier of their customs. There's the barrier of their social structure. There's the barrier of their commitments to one another in community. And our goal is to try to help get over those barriers, to try to remove the cultural barriers that people have so they can hear the message, and then the only barrier between them and Christ is the barrier of unbelief. So as we look at community tonight, I want you to look at it within this context. Let's pray together before we begin. Our Father, we just come tonight and we thank you for the tremendous challenge that you've given us for world evangelism. We thank you, Lord, that you have already done an incredible work in mobilizing people around the world to reach unreached peoples. Lord, we thank you that the number of unreached groups is dropping significantly as people have committed their lives to church planting and evangelism. And now, Lord, we come tonight and we pray that you'd guide us in the hours that we have here together tonight to think through the issues of community and understand how community is an important part of the relationships between people, and how relationships are an important part of people's willingness to hear or not to hear the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We pray, Lord, that you would help us to understand community, and in understanding it, understand how knowing community is an important part of our ministry to the people. We commit this to you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, in looking at Lecture 7 on our 4th session this night, the focus of the lecture is on this issue of community. So we begin by first asking the question, what makes community? As you think about what makes community, I want you to think about the diversity of peoples you saw in the video. Think about large crowds in cities. Think about rural areas where people live much more dispersed in their relationship with one another. Think about different age groups, the children, the elderly, those who are men, those who are women. All of that is an important dimension of what constitutes community in terms of human cultures. As anthropologists have looked at community over more than 100 years, we understand that there are certain kind of patterns that we can find in community around the world. And so in our lecture tonight, we'll be looking at some of those patterns, and then as we think about the issues of application of research tools, we'll try to show you how you can do research to basically understand the community where you're working. Okay, first of all, thinking about community, neighborhood is a concept that you're all familiar with, and the idea of neighborhood is one that you probably have experienced. You live in a neighborhood. You have people around you that you're familiar with. But neighborhoods are different. If you think about perhaps the neighborhood that you live in now, and compare that to the neighborhood that you experienced as a child, they may not be the same. I grew up in a small town in northern Ohio called Elyria. And in that particular town, there were big old houses built in 1900. There were trees all over the place. There were schools, and we tended to know the people around us. It was an urban community, but it was not so big that it wasn't one in which you didn't know a lot of other people. And so I went to school there. I got to know people in that school. I went to high school with the same people. And so I had continuity in my relationships in that community because there were many people who I knew over a long period of time. When I left that town to go to college, I went off to an urban area, Chicago, Illinois. Much, much larger place. Many, many millions of more people, and a very different kind of community. I now live in Los Angeles, and again in Los Angeles the community is quite different than the one that I lived in when I was a young child growing up back in Ohio. So as we think about neighborhoods, neighborhoods are different. Okay? And the difference between them are some of the things that you want to begin to find out. Is it, for example, a neighborhood in which people know each other? In which there is a sense of belonging, a sense of common meaning, and a sense of common purpose? Or is it a neighborhood when you don't know anybody else? You know, there are some neighborhoods right around this university where people don't know the names of anybody else who are their neighbors. Whereas there are neighborhoods where everybody knows everybody. And so what kind of a neighborhood is it? What are the connections that go on between people? As we look at neighborhood, then, we want to try to get into understanding what happens there. Are there activities that are common in the neighborhood? Are there economic exchanges that occur between people that are there? Are there any shared meanings about that neighborhood? Is there anything that unites them together? In one of our readings that we had a little bit earlier in this semester, you read about a shrine festival in Tokyo. Well, that shrine festival case study shows you there were a lot of people who knew each other in that community. They had ongoing interactions with each other each year in this shrine festival. And so it was not a neighborhood where people were unknown to one another. If you, in contrast, would come into the place where I live here in La Mirada, there are no annual rituals that we go to. There are no annual festivals that my neighbors participate in. There are no activities that we actually do together. Basically, what we do in my neighborhood is we sleep there and we eat there inside our houses. There is no particular activity that brings us together and causes us to have some kind of community. So if you look at neighborhood, then the Tokyo neighborhood, Tokyo is a huge city, but that particular neighborhood has much more meaning and much more unity than the neighborhood that I have in the this small city of 40,000 people in greater Los Angeles area. Your research then has to begin to decipher what really is the glue that ties people together in a neighborhood. And you have to begin by asking those questions, by watching what happens, by seeing if there are things that bring people together. Oftentimes, a neighborhood will have a central place. And if there is a central place, then that may be something that ties people together. It might be a store where people come and sit around and talk and drink soda or beer or some other beverage or just coffee, visit with one another in that kind of a context. It might be that there are cafes or restaurants where people gather, and those provide the central place for people to interact with one another. You may find that there are common places like parks or like a town square. In one of the articles that you had assigned, you have the notion of a plaza in a Central American town and the difference between the marketplace and the plaza. And things happen in the market that don't happen in the plaza, and things happen in the plaza that don't happen in the market. So oftentimes there are central places where people gather and certain kinds of things happen. Those central places can be places where people know one another, where they have common relationships and where they interact with one another. In my particular social life, my church is a central place. It's not a place where people who live around it go, but it's a place where people who are within driving distance go. And we go there on a regular basis every week, and we meet one another, we know one another, we have common values and common beliefs. So as we look at that particular community, that community is a place for us. It meets in a place, and it becomes a center place for us to engage in our relationships with one another. In looking then at any culture in which you're studying, one of the questions you want to ask is, what are the central places? What are people doing in these places? How are they interacting with one another in those places? And is that a place where I can make friends? One of my friends is doing research and ministry among Muslims in Brussels, in Belgium. And what this friend has found is that if he goes to the coffee shops where the men gather for coffee, that is the place where he can meet them, the place where he can make friends, the place where he can listen to their stories and tell his own stories. And of course, as he's learned their language and understands their culture, some of the stories that he relates are stories from the Scripture. And they have conversations about those stories, and he has developed relationships which allow him to interact with those men in that central place. So the central place is an important place where you may have the freedom to do things that you could not do in people's homes, that you could not do in some other kind of relationship in the community. An anthropologist by the name of Robert Redfield spent quite a bit of time focusing on the nature of communities. And Redfield found that if a culture was fairly homogeneous, then that the communities tended to be homogeneous as well. And one of the things that you'll find even in, I mentioned earlier that North India is a place where you have the largest number of unreached people groups in the world. I think if you would go to North India, you would find a lot of homogeneous communities in that area. You'd find villages and towns where everybody spoke the same language, where they had the same basic religion, where they knew everybody. They had kinship ties. There were organizations of clans and kinsmen in the community, organization of caste. And so that these organizations would be structured in such a way that people really would know one another. Redfield talks about these kind of communities as really being distinctive ethnically, distinctive linguistically, distinctive in terms of their religious beliefs, and distinctive in terms of their homogeneity and their actual commitment to one another and to sustaining their cultural systems. These kind of communities tend to be more difficult to penetrate with the gospel than communities that are urban. In urban places, people have left that social pressure. They moved out into a setting where there's a lot of diversity and a lot of difference. They may cluster with a group of people that are like them, but they're continually engaging people who are not like them. They go out into the world and they have contacts that are much more diverse. So if you have a small, distinct, homogeneous community, and I mean small, 3,000 or 4,000, then that kind of community may be slow changing and may be resistant to the gospel. Now, of course, if God has already prepared the people and they're eagerly awaiting the coming of someone with the good news, then you may have a people movement instead. Just the opposite will happen. You'll have this tremendous response to the good news of Christ. There are some missionaries who went to New Guinea back in the 60s, and they went into these homogeneous rural communities in the highlands of New Guinea, and they preached the gospel in those places. And they had this incredible experience of finding that after a short time, all of the leaders got together and discussed this, and they decided this was true, and the whole community came to Christ. Well, the missionaries didn't know what to do. They'd never seen anything like this in their whole lives. They'd never heard stories like this. And they were astonished at this tremendous movement of people. Doug Hayward, who's on our faculty here, is one who worked among the Western Dani where that actually occurred, and where the whole community came to Christ in one fell swoop at one particular moment in time. Well, communities then can be very responsive, like the Grand Valley Dani, the Western Dani, or they can be slow and resistant and unwilling to change, like some of those communities that we've seen in northern India. And so as we look at community, you have to take the temperature of the community, if you will. You have to see whether the Holy Spirit is working there. You have to sense their receptiveness. And then you have to develop a strategy to reach them that is based upon where they are and the kind of things that they will allow in terms of your engaging them with this message of the gospel. I mentioned the fact that urban communities are more open. Very typically around the world, you'll find that dispersed urban communities are much easier to work with than small, homogeneous communities. The reason for that is that these communities tend to be scattered instead of focused. Now, what do I mean by a dispersed urban community? What I mean is what I describe with my church. It's a religious urban community. We don't live in the same place. We are within driving distance of the church. We have a central place where we go, and we go there every week at the same times. And so we have interaction with one another. We know the people there. We sometimes have interactions outside of that setting in our homes. But it's a community that is primarily religious in its focus. And it's scattered. It's scattered probably over a radius of about 17 to 20 miles. People come from all around in different directions to that particular location. Now that's really a very typical example of a dispersed urban community. You can have the same thing with Indian. Let's say we have North Indians living in Norwalk, California. Well, they live scattered all around in Norwalk. But if you go over to Norwalk and go down Pioneer Boulevard, you'll come to Indian restaurants. You'll come to Indian shops, a whole shopping center over there. And if you go into those shops and talk to the customers, you'll find that the customers in the shops and the customers in the restaurants tend to know each other, that they constitute a dispersed urban Indian community. They have this common background from either North or South India, and they participate then in these networks over here in Norwalk, California, because of their ethnic background. So that is an ethnic dispersed urban community, whereas mine is a religious dispersed urban community. Both of them they're scattered people living among a whole group of other peoples, but they have this cohesive organization. Their interactions tend to be part-time. In other words, I go to church on Sunday mornings, I go to church sometimes on Sunday evenings, sometimes I go during the week for particular activities. I have people come to my home, but all the rest of the time I'm engaging with other people. I have a different group of people I work with, a different group of people that I live in the neighborhood with, so that my religious community is a part-time community. These Indians in Norwalk are again engaged in part-time community relationships. They're not full-time in terms of their structure. So as you look at these dispersed urban communities, they will be communities that meet occasionally. As you're working with people here in California and doing your research projects, probably most of them will be part of dispersed urban communities. And so this whole notion is a very important one for how you do your research. You want to find out the dispersion. What are the connections? What are the places where they come together? And how do they sustain these relationships over a period of time? There are some characteristics about them that are homogeneous. For example, they may come from a common language area in India, or they just may have common origin from this nation in Central Asia, or they may have common goals and interests, and that what has brought them together really are those common goals and interests. They may have some family connections and networks that are related to where they work and things of that nature. And so what you want to do is find out what those networks are, what those connections are. One of the things I mentioned to James in our pre-session was that in looking at the connections between immigrants to the United States, You want to find out if their family is not important to them, who acts like family toward them. Who are the people that take the responsibilities that family would take because family's not here? Who in fact constitute the fictional family of these people in the communities where you study? One of the key characteristics of these dispersed urban communities is that they're self-sustaining. In other words, that their transactions among members, exchanges that go on between them, that perpetuate the life of the group. In your outline it says transitions, it should be transactions. Transactions means the social and economic exchanges that go between people in that group context. All right, what makes community then? We can see that it's ethnic, it's language, it's more than that, however, it's commitment, it's engagement, it's having some common interest, it's meeting together on at least a part-time basis, and it's doing it in a sustained way so that there is a frequency of interaction. You know people and they know you, and you continue those relationships over a long period of time. All of those things become part of community. So it doesn't have to be a village to have community. It can be a dynamic urban phenomena that has very similar characteristics to what Robert Redfield has called the rural homogeneous kind of community. Okay, as we go further and begin to explore the characteristics of community, we begin by looking at resources. Every community has some kind of resource base. When I think about my church, our building is an important part of the resource. And we do a lot of work to sustain that building. We are concerned about its maintenance. We're concerned about whether people abuse it. And so we really invest in that community resource as an important part of our identity and who we are. So every community has some kind of resource interest and resource base. It may be very, very small. I had one student doing a project with a very temporary kind of community in Santa Ana, California last year. And in that particular project, the only thing they had in common was a restaurant that they met at. But they had staked that restaurant out. It was something they went to every week, and it was the restaurant knew they were the main customers that week. It was their territory for that time. Now, they didn't own it, but they occupied it, and they occupied it every week at the same time. That was their territory for that particular moment. And they developed relationships over a long period of time. Sometimes there were different people that came, and they weren't always the same people. But they had developed an ethnic-based, it was Hispanic, predominantly Hispanic, and it was an ethnic-based community that came together for a common political interest. So it was their interest and their ethnicity that brought them together in this particular location. Now, as we look at resources, one of the questions that I would ask on trying to understand community is how are the resources shared and distributed within the community? Because usually community has some resource base. For example, again, my local church, the people who go there give offerings every Sunday. And so there is a resource that comes from the people. Those offerings are then distributed for the interest of those people there. And so when the youth ministry isn't going well, the people who are giving money to the church for the youth ministry, they don't give it specifically for that, they're giving it to the Lord. But when the youth ministry is not going well, they say, we're giving our tithe here and we're not getting back what we want. You know, our young people aren't being cared for. And so their interests have to be met. And they're looking at how those resources are being used in reference to their particular interest. So as we look at community, how interests are distributed and collected and distributed, if you will, among the people is a very important part of this. There are a variety of different kinds of things that you find in terms of community. Land and space are oftentimes part of community, but they don't have to be in a dispersed urban community. The space could be a space that you occupy, like the church on Sunday. It could be the restaurant that we talked about, or it could actually be a village with houses and community property and community meeting places and natural resources. A whole host of things could be part of community. In addition to those kinds of things, there are also cultural materials that are part of space, and they can be important. Faith, for example, is thinking about a retirement home or a retirement facility where people meet for recreation. Well, if you look at that, what kind of recreational resources are there? And do people enjoy those particular resources? Is that an attraction to them to come? There is a place down in Laguna Beach that I occasionally have gone by where people come to do lawn bowling. Well, this lawn bowling ground is a very important spatial and material resource. And you have to have membership to get in there. And there are people who are members who've paid their dues to come in and participate in the recreation of the lawn bowling. Well, in looking at that kind of activity, you see that the materials are an important part of who they are and what they do. So what really are the materials that are important to these people in terms of their community relationship? Now, if you look at those things, sometimes you'll find that the materials are just utilitarian. Sometimes you'll find that those materials can have very important symbolic value. They can be sacred materials. They can have power in terms of what people's beliefs are. And so this is something that you'll want to discover as you explore this issue. I had a project on a community up in Whittier that was actually part of a Buddhist, American Buddhist community a few years ago. And the key elements of space that were important were the places where they did meditation. And that whole meditation process was something that was very important in their thinking about the social structure and the social relationships that they had. All right. The material culture basically is involved in what we call the social construction of reality. And as we look at how space and materials are ordered, we're looking basically at two different dimensions of how the social reality is defined. I start out with the notion that material culture is a part of what we sometimes call in our anthropological jargon the social construction of reality. If you think of the video that I showed you and the mosque is a very important place for Muslims. It's a place that has very significant definitions of what can and what can't happen. It was just a very brief clip, but if you remember the video, you had just a large space full of men in very close association with one another, bowing with their heads to the floor. Okay? Now, there were no women there. That's an important part of the order of Muslim space. The space separates men and women. And it's very important that you abide by the rules of the space. And as the space is defined in terms of what can happen there, there's a place of prayer. There's a particular time of prayer. And when that time comes, everybody in unison participates in the prayer rituals that are an important part of that community. Once the prayer is over, then other things can happen. But that is sacred space. And so you have to be observe appropriate behavior within that sacred space. You cannot do anything that would be in any ways offensive. For example, wearing your shoes into that space would be completely unacceptable. The shoes have to be left outside. That's an important part of the definition of that space. So if you look at the social construction of reality, the mosque itself is just a large space, but there are very clear rules about what has to happen in that particular place. Now, another clip that you saw in the video was a group of women gathered together in the center of a village, kind of a village plaza. And they were engaging in some interaction with one another in that place. If you remember that brief clip, it was women alone in that context. So if you look at the definition of activity there and the limitations and the kind of things that were done, it would be interesting to explore why women alone. What was the purpose? What were they up to? What was the meaning that went into all of that activity in that particular place? So the space that you look at has to do with how people think about their reality. And they bring certain kinds of cultural conceptions to that reality, and it defines for them what is important in that space. Their sacred and secular is one important dimension of that. Male and female is another important dimension. Public and private is a third dimension. And if you think of those different issues, then what you want to do is try to define which of those issues are most important for you. And you can then work with the cultural concepts and begin to understand how they work for the people who are there. The central place theory that I have on the screen looks at the notion that central places are very powerful places of significance within the meaning system of the community. And central place theory basically says that the the kind of space that provides centers for communities will define the dynamic interactions of people within that community context. The article that I shared with you about the market and the plaza by Miles Richardson is an interesting one, because what Richardson shares in that article is that there are very different rules of behavior in the marketplace as opposed to the plaza. There's very different symbolism in the marketplace as opposed to the plaza. Do you remember? What are the differences? What happens in the marketplace?
Basically, nature is being sold, and basically you have to make the most of the time you're there. Yet things are on the go, and they accept people for who they are, where they're at. You could be dressed down or you could be dressed up. They don't really care about that.
Okay, it doesn't matter how you're dressed.
Yeah.
Speak up so we can hear you. It's really a dynamic place with a lot of buying and selling, and you can dress however you want. You wouldn't wear, it doesn't matter whether you wear a coat like this, whether you wear a t-shirt. It's just wide open arena, okay? How is the plaza different? Somebody else. Peter?
It's more serene. You have people who are interacting with one another in small groups. It's not as dynamic as the marketplace. And you're not calling out for attention from others to buy or sell, but you're privately interacting with one another.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. And as you think about that, as you picture this in your mind, what pictures does it bring to your mind as you think about being in the plaza? You used the word serene, okay? If you were to describe what you'd think of people there, what would you think about, Martha?
It seems like the interaction would be different in terms of the level of intimacy and contact that people have with one another.
Okay, the interaction would be different. The level of contact that people would have would be different. How well do you think people would know one another in the plaza? Very well? Okay. Whereas in the marketplace, does it matter how well you know one another? Jane?
To some degree it does, in the sense that if you know the regular customer and the merchant, you have better possibility of a sale.
Okay, excellent. That's right. If you know the regular customers, you treat them well, that increases your possibility of selling. So knowing them and having a relationship can be of benefit there. But clearly in the plaza, that relationship is prerequisite, isn't it, to the interaction there. And it's a much more formal kind of setting. Okay. If you then think about the central places here, they have very different definitions of the dynamics of social behavior. And that really is something that's just useful to look for then. What are the dynamics of behavior that occur in different kinds of places? For example, put this into your context. What kind of social interaction are you allowed to have in the midst of a church service as opposed to out in the patio afterwards? You know, it depends on the church, but you know, clearly there's a difference in every church, because in my church, you have to beg the congregation to say anything if the pastor is preaching, but you get them out in the patio and it's just chaos. You know, it's all kinds of noise going on, you know, in other churches, why, there's quite a bit of interaction between the pastor and the people, but it's different from the interaction you'd have outside again, because the dynamics of the place and what's proper in the place defines these meanings. All right, let's go on. As we move to the case study tonight, I've asked James to do some mapping for us again, and this particular map that we have over here is a continuing part of his community. I'll move it out so that we can get it a little more in the light. I've asked James to come up, and so you can start, James, and put your microphone on here, and talk to us about some of the different things about this particular community. I'd like for him to think about, first of all, the notion of regional context, and tell us just a little bit about the region within this community occurs. You can move right up close to your map there. And
may you rephrase your question?
I'm thinking about the difference between local and region. So what do we have here on the map?
Okay, this is what we had last week about Mbuver, Kavele, and Gi. We had only this space here. But around us here, or around this location here, is the community. And here we have David, Kavoy, John, Kikuvi, Mulumba, Deto, Chongo, Kavuti, Mudama, Mawa. All of these people are related. They are related. In fact, they come from one father. And all of them could be called the Mudamboas, Mudamboa. Now here, you can see Kimeu is the man that was given a place by Ndolo. This is Nduku, the mother of my father. And this is Ngina, the second wife of my grandfather. Now, all of them live along here. Duku is related to the Mudemboa. Duku is related to the Mudemboa. In fact, very close to Kavoy. They are brother, sister, very related. John is related to Chongo. John is the son of Chongo. David is the son of Chongo. And Deto is the brother of Chongo and Kavuti. Now, down here, there is a city known as Mumandu City. And we have a river here, and this river is known as Ndolo River because it occupied a lot of his land alone. And down here, there is a dam where all of these people come to draw water, and their cattle come there. Mulinga is there. The half-brothers of my father, Mutunga and Chungu, are there again. But coming on this side, you find Musau, Nzuko, Ndeti, Mbaluku, Mbwika, Masilia. These are related, and they are related to my father. They belong to the clan of my father. This is a different clan, known as Aombe, and that's why they live there. This is my father's clan along this zone. And Moa belongs to my father's clan, Buva clan, Avanga clan. Solomon, he just came to live there. Kameli, he just came to live there. Bwika. This is a central area, Yanzoni Primary School. This is where I began my school. Preschool here, kindergarten, and then primary 1. I went here. So it's not far from our home. It is here. Then down here is Bwika. And down here, when people multiply, there was another school created, Changuli. And Chalo lives there. Now, Chalo and Kamusingili, this is Kamusingili, and some other people here, Mutava, Deto, Muindu, and Chalo again here. This is where his first wife lives. This is his second wife. And Kilonzo and Cheti, they are related. They are close. We belong to the same tribe, but they are the same clan, the same clan, but they are very related. They are like a family. Then down here, there is Kamuwani Shopping Center. Here is where we buy things. We meet there. And Elu, as you can see, he has a kind of horseshoe kind of piece of land. He comes to the city here, and then he extends outside the city. Now here is the central area where my forefathers used to worship. This time we drew it here. Now, the reason why I put it there is because it was going to be connected with Kamuwani AIC, which is a church. That church began here. We began to go Sunday school here. And I was wondering, how can we be at the Idembo, which means the shrine, where our grandfathers worshipped, and around these trees, we used to have Sunday school. Around these trees, we used to have Sunday school, but when the Sunday schools grew up, we came and established a church here. We were given this piece of land here by Ndeto. Ndeto owned a piece of land here, and said, I give you my piece of land. And down here is Zomo. So all of these people are related by clan, not tribe, just clan. Mutua belongs to the Mbuva clan, Mutava, all of these people. Savali is a brother of my father, Mbuva here. So he is close there. And we can either choose to go to Chamunyu, which is a shopping center here. There's another shopping center here. And there is another shopping center down this way. But we tend to go to Mumandu. This is Mumandu Shopping Center because most of our people belong here. We have another clan, a huge clan down here. And my mother's people come from down here. And so when we come here, we can meet my mother's people and we can meet my clansmen around that zone. So this is how beautiful the community is. And this is the Kamuwani village community. Now, when we...
Let me ask you a couple of questions, all right? This is all kinds of information, and we're going to be lost. Okay, so how many actual clans do we have here, then? 3 that you've counted off for us on this map?
The actual clans are 2.
Okay. This is the one on the, above the river?
This one above the river here is one clan by the name Aombe clan.
Okay, and then all of this one here is another clan.
All of this, except him, he belongs to another clan of Atangwa and Solomon. In fact, this Solomon and this man belong to my mother's clan.
Okay. But
he is closer to my mother. So all of these people here coming this way and coming then here belong to the second clan.
Okay, and that's the clan that your father is part of?
Yes, that is the clan of my father. Now, the most significant thing is this clan marries from this clan, and this clan marries from this clan. When I was growing, my grandmother Nduku told me, don't marry from my clan. Those women are bad. They overrule the man. And she comes from that clan.
So she overrules her husband, huh?
Consequently, my grandfather was very strong. But when he died, she took over the leadership.
Okay, all right.
So she led my father. And she didn't like women from here. I don't know whether she felt threatened when they came or what. But she really advised me not to marry. Graciously, I did not. I married from another tribe, clan.
Now, a third clan is your mother's clan, which lives on the other side of the shopping center.
Here,
Okay,
somewhere there.
Good. If you just think about this area, are there a lot of more clans around? In other words, off of the map?
The way the clan tends to go, going this way, my clan extends down over Mumandu area, because this is Mumandu area. It extends. It's so huge down around that zone. And my mother's clan is down here. Now, coming here, there are other clans formed. Other clans are formed, and we are not related. We don't belong to Kamuwani village community. Now, going down here, again, my clan is extended down that way, the Adanga clan. So, one significant thing here, this is a church. The church is made of mainly the Adanga.
Your clan?
My people, my clan. And I discovered that one day when I was preaching, and I came and said, hey, my uncle there, my aunt there, oh, everybody, I told them, you belong to one clan. What is happening? And a few from this other clan here. In fact, the family of Chongo, where's Chongo? Chongo, we worship with them, and Ndeto and Mawa. And again, they are attracted because of the common intermarital relationships.
Okay, now is there a church then on up in their way that they go to? Their people go to?
Here, I forgot to have this here because of the pressure. There's another church there.
Okay.
And in fact, there is another church here.
How far are these churches apart? A mile, 2 miles?
3 miles.
3 miles?
3 miles.
Okay.
Yeah, and people just decide to erect a church. Where they drop down there, they say a church here.
Are they AIC churches, all of them Africa Inland churches?
Yes, AIC churches. This is AIC church. Down here there is another church which is in Baptist, but very small.
Okay.
And mainly people that go here are people that cannot fit here and cannot fit here.
Are they from a different clan, or are they
No, the
just
same clan.
Same clan, they just had trouble.
And again, I said they cannot fit here and they cannot fit here.
Okay. Now, we could get into that. I want to ask another question before I forget, though. You live right down here in this compound. Why don't you go to this shopping center? Why do you go all the way up there? And who goes to this one?
This one, we send children to go there.
Okay. Okay.
And it's a young, growing city, but it has not much many things as we want to have. However, this kind of city here enables us to meet people from different areas. People from my mother's side, and our clan here, you know, and many people tend to come here. Okay. So it is a very focal place. This is where the chief has baraza. Baraza, the meeting place, we meet here. This is where DC, District Commissioner, comes, and the DEO, District Educational Officers, come here. So there is something here that is of attraction. Okay. So the city itself is very political.
Okay, let's ask these students a question here. As you have heard James now, what would you say is the difference in terms of the church and the market as central places in his culture? What have you learned as you've listened?
Seems like the church is a place where only his clansmen, clan people gather, whereas the marketplace is where all of his clans as well as others gather together.
Okay, all right. And if you look, the distinction then, the church being a place where the clansmen gather, what's, as you listen to his discussion about the marketplace, why is that marketplace really important in terms of the marketplace of choice?
I think it's more centrally located, but he mentioned there's another clan up north.
Okay.
Or up,
yes,
up above it.
It's true north.
And
okay.
Also that because of the more leadership comes to that area.
Okay, now if you were interviewing him and you wanted to ask him the next question, what question would you ask next?
Where's the government building? Is there any
Okay, where are the government buildings? I was thinking of a relationship question instead of a space question. That's a good question. Where are the buildings and what happens there? And you'd want to follow that up. But what relationship does he mention time and time again as he's talked about the marketplace? Who do we meet there?
The mother's clan.
Okay, the mother's clan. And that must be important to him, so you want to follow that up. Who are the people in the mother's clan that he meets there? Why do they look forward to this opportunity? How often does his mother go there? Who does she meet when she's there? That would be a very important question to ask and to work on as you evaluate this process. So, all right. Any other questions you'd ask him?
Just a question about the Ilu tribe, or what relationship do they play? Or were they displaced, or why are they small, and why are they actively involved like the other clans are?
Okay, you want to answer that question?
Yes, Ilu comes from the Atangwa tribe of my mother, but from a different cluster. And so when he is here, he is just like a loner. He's very much alone. Even he doesn't interact with my clansmen. And that's all I can say about it. And he doesn't have brothers or sisters around him. And he's alone.
Okay, one of the things that we have learned in looking at this diagram is that there's a bigger region around. Now, as you look at the case study outline that I've given you, You have the regional context and the local context. What we have here is a wonderful map of the local context. We've got the town, we've got the village, we've got the neighborhood, we've got the shopping area, we have the churches, and so we've got an excellent map of the local context. It would allow us to ask all kinds of questions. For example, you could follow up the questions on the churches. Who attends those different churches? And how are the pastors there? And which one is bigger than the other ones? And are there any rivalries between them? And how do they interact with one another? There are some other shopping centers we'd want to find out about. One question I would ask is, do some of the other clans go to that shopping center or this one? And do their relatives live nearby there? In other words, what are the motivations that connect them? Or are they much smaller and less significant and maybe not really important other than for children to go shopping? Let's see.
Amazingly here, though this clan is very close to this shopping center. In fact, it belongs to Mudama and another friend of his that lives somewhere here. Most of his clansmen do not come here.
Okay.
So the shopping center is like abandoned or limited to very small things like salt, sugar. But these people, again, come to Mumandu.
Okay.
These people come to Mumandu. And this region, all of this region, in fact, by the time I was here, after worshiping, we all came here to Mumandu.
Okay.
We have a road. We all came here.
You walk or take a taxi?
We can walk if we want to have stories as we climb, but we can also take a bus, taxi, and we come and meet with other people of this clan.
Okay.
I mean of this church. One thing
Okay.
I did not say, this was a branch of this. When we were worshiping here, sorry, let me connect this well. When the Sunday school was here, in fact, the shrine was alone. We were using some trees. When this Sunday school was here, we belonged to Mumandu, AIC here. But then we grew up, and we had this as our Sunday school as we grew up. Then this church, Mumandu, gave us mandatory or kind of autonomous leadership. So we came here and began to worship here. So the people here are related to us. Mm-hmm. So we want, after we finish service here, we want to come and meet them here in the city, have a cup of tea together, have the ribs of the goats and of the cows together, and just have a wonderful time. That's a very beautiful place.
Okay. Now you can see the connection here and why the space is an important part. His discussion of what goes on in this space gives you already a very important understanding of the social connections and the linkages between people and how those relationships are important. As we think about our analysis, last week we looked at the domestic context in the compound house and apartment. One of the things we want to do is we want to just summarize how important the map is in terms of understanding a community. What we've done here is with this map, all of a sudden you've seen so much more about the culture than you saw before. The map basically has contributed a whole new understanding of relationships, right? It's given you different groups to look at. You now have an idea of clan. What is the clan like? How is it organized? What's going on in those clan relationships? So the map itself is really an important part of getting into that. We know something about social networks because what we've seen here is that this church connection, they started out as a Sunday school. They had relationships with each other. And now those relationships have expanded into different kinds of connections. We have culture expressed in the space. The old culture here of the ritual, the sacred place, and the problem that created because are we going to worship there? And should we worship in some other setting? So those are important parts of what we work at. If you're going to take this tool further, you can map events. We talked about that as we looked at the events last week. And in those events, you can explore the things that we've looked at, interests, social meaning, the kind of language that people use for them. All of that's a part of what we do as we look at the understanding of culture. One of the last things that I think we want to look at is the issue of social power in community. And I'll just take a minute to talk about that before I close. If we looked here at this map, James has given us clans, and he's given us churches, he's given us the community. One of the things we want to find out is what are the power relationships within that community. You asked the question about the government buildings. What's important about the government buildings? How can we understand the church authority structure? Which of those churches is more important than the others? How does the power work in those places? And then we also have what we call the ecosystem. The ecosystem is really basically the social relationships that support that power system. If you think about the shopping center, he's told us there's all kinds of clans around here that meet here. And it's their social ties that also are important for the merchants, because they come there to meet each other as well as to buy things. And so that social connection is really a social ecosystem that supports the power system that's operating there. Well, we'll review this as we look at a different case study in our next lecture. Let's take a break. All right, as we continue our session tonight, we'll go on to Lecture 8. The subject of this lecture is kin and clan. I've chosen to take this time and to tell you about a 2-week project that I had in a village in Cameroon back a long time ago now, in the late 1970s. The purpose of sharing this case study with you is to show you that you can use the tools that we're developing in this class in a very short period of time to accomplish a tremendous amount of learning and knowledge. Sometimes when I teach this course, and we have people who are missionaries who are thinking about going to the mission field, they think, oh, well, this is just so much work. Who would ever want to do this? And, you know, I didn't go there to spend my time studying social organization. I went there to do ministry. Well, what I'm doing this case study for this evening is to show you that in 2 weeks, you can gain a tremendous amount of knowledge about a people and a culture that you would never get if you didn't use these tools. These tools really are geared to give you fast-track, intense cultural learning at a depth and a substance that you would never have if you didn't have the tools. And you don't need to spend your whole ministry time doing it. In fact, anytime you target a new community, if you spent your first 2 weeks doing what I'm going to talk about in the next hour, you would actually get much better relationships in the community. You'd have a much better network of people. And when you began your ministry, you'd find that there were people that were already interested in hearing from you and talking with you because you built relationships and you know an awful lot about them. Now, this particular community is a community of 5,000 people. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the tools that I use to try to study them with a very short period of time. The pictures that I show as I illustrate this lecture come from the community, and they will at least give you some visual understanding of the kind of place that I'm talking about. I went to this place in the highlands of Cameroon in the Anglophone area in 1978. Being in the Anglophone area is very important because that meant I could speak English and they could speak English and we could understand each other. That's why I could do this in 2 weeks. If you don't have language, it's much harder. You could still learn a lot in 2 weeks without language, but language just makes it so much easier. Now, in this context, the first thing that I did when I went into the community is begin to make personal contacts. I obviously contacted missionary personnel who were there. The Summer Institute of Linguistics was working in this place, and I made contact first with the SIL people who were there and began to get acquainted with the community through them. I asked them just some basic questions. What do you know about the community? Tell me about the people that are here, the church, and whatever else that they knew. And so they were very helpful in introducing me to their understanding of the community. In addition to the missionaries, I was working specifically with a committee called the Yamba Bible Translation Committee. I went there primarily to do a very short-term research project to help this committee understand, and SIL understand, why they were losing support of the churches in terms of their Bible translation project. Now, I'll come back to that later, but I want to start out by saying that I had a particular focus. there was a main question to be asked. And that question was, here we have one project in all of Cameroon where the churches have really gotten behind the Bible translation. They're excited about this project. They want to get it done. And now our committee is losing support. What's happened? And why is the committee losing support? And what can we do to bring about a change in this process? So these people in the Yama Translation Committee knew that I'd come there for that purpose. I was there to work with them. And so they also provided a bridge for me into the community. So I had two basic sources of personal contacts to start with. People who were friendly. That always helps. Because if you have people that are friendly, then you can begin to work in a community and they will open doors for you and help you to learn the things that you need to know. Now, as I started out, one of the first things that I did was participant observation. I decided, you laugh at that creature at that time, 1970s haircut, right? Long hair, mustache. You know, it shows right away. You can just tell that that's the way the world is. I was thinner, too. You know, you get old, you gain weight. So, it was a fun place to go because I spent 2 weeks with this family. I ate with them every morning and every evening. Okay? And when I got there, I realized that if I wanted to learn this culture, I had to have in-depth relationships. And I wouldn't get that by living in the missionary's house and eating with the missionaries that were there every day. I had to get some connection with people that were there. So I asked my missionary team friends there, would they arrange for me to eat with a particular African family? They said, you're going to get sick. I said, I don't care. I didn't come here to sit in your house for 2 weeks. I really have to have contact with the family. That was the wisest decision I made. And I really learned to love these people during the time that I was there. Mr. Ngea was a school teacher in the community. He was also a member of the Bible Translation Committee. And so there were two key connections that he provided for me. He attended the local church, he was a member of the Translation Committee, and he was also recognized in the community because of his role as a school teacher. His wife was very kind to me. Their children are there in the background. Every morning at 10 o'clock, I'd show up at his house, and we'd stand around and talk for a while. Then we'd go in and sit down. And then his oldest son, the tall one there, would bring in a basin of water, and we would wash our hands. And then he would take the basin back out, and he would bring in the food and put it on the table. And Mr. Ngea and I would sit there and eat in lonely splendor. The children and the wife all ate out in the kitchen, and they ate separately from the men. James is resonating with that. He says, correct, okay. In this particular setting then, I had about 2 hours with this man in the morning and 2 hours with this man in the evening every day. We had to talk. You know, you just can't sit around the table and not talk. And so, what do I talk about? Well, I start out with, tell me about your family. And who is your father and who is your mother? And I said, my memory is pretty short. Do you mind if I write some of this down? He says, oh, no, not at all. So I did my genealogy, not an extensive one, but one that would help me to understand his relationship, because I wanted to know who his relatives were. I learned about his clan. I learned about why he was living in this particular place. I learned about his job. But we talked about a lot of things. He asked me all kinds of questions about my family. He asked me about my job. And so I told him stories about myself. And we had 4 hours every day, 2 in the morning and 2 in the evening, in which we sat and talked. And it was an incredible time. I learned more around this table than I learned at any other source of information that I had. Now, it was a very rich time because I had a good reason to be there. I bought the meat, by the way, contributed to the meal. They then provided everything else, the labor, the cooking, and all of that. And we didn't eat much meat. The meat was pretty expensive. I gave them the money. They bought it. But the children had to eat. The wife had to eat. So usually a little chunk of meat like that would be about as much as I would get at any particular mealtime. And, of course, the wonderful mound of corn fufu, they call it in Cameroon. It's a cornmeal mush that is the staple for every meal that you have in a situation like this. Well, in taking this time, Mr. Ngea also had people he met at the market in the afternoon. And about the third day there, I said, well, I'd come up to his house, he wouldn't be there. And his son said, well, he's down at the market. So I walked down to the market, and I found that if I went to the market, that that was also an important place where I could get acquainted with people. And there would always be other men at the market. I'd go down to the market and visit with them. We'd go into a place, and they would drink a little palm wine. And I wasn't teaching at Biola then, so I had palm wine with them. And, you know, it was an interesting time of sitting together and talking together and just getting fellowship with one another at that time in understanding them and their culture.
Maybe there were no rules.
Well, maybe there were no rules. Okay. As we made these connections, I began to develop some research strategies. Now, the kind of strategies that we're going to talk about tonight are strategies that focus on how do you learn a community in a very short period of time. How do you understand what's going on there? One of the first things that I found was that the people were busy, that men had work to do, women had work to do, and that if I wanted to do some of the things that I've described to you, they didn't have time for this. No man had time to take me out and help me do a map of the community. But here's a 13-year-old boy who has got time. He's not in school at this particular time of the year, and so he took me on the tour of the community. His English was getting good enough because of his schooling that we could talk together. And so his father assigned him to me, and he became my helper and my informant for this work. And so he then provided an excellent opportunity for me after my morning meal and before my evening meal to go out and visit in the community. And he was not only my guide, but he was also my interpreter. And then we would meet people from one place to another while he could talk to them and he could interpret for me. One of the things that we did then, I was there with an SIL colleague, so he and I both worked together. We discovered very soon when we were there that the village was divided up into what they called quarters. Now, it's not, there were 4 of them, there were 12 of them. So 12 quarters meant 12 major sections in the village. And it was 5,000 people. Well, we can't study 5,000 people in 2 weeks. And so what Dan and I decided to do was he would take one quarter and I would take the other one. And so Benjamin took me into his quarter, and we began to walk through the quarter. We went house to house, place to place, and I gradually developed a map of the quarter, sketched in the road like James did for us on his map, put the compounds on each side of the map, and then we would walk on the road, stop at the compound. He would tell me who lived there, and so I'd write down the names of the people that lived there. And as we just walked through this whole area, gradually I would had a map and the names of the people that were in each of these places. Now, after we gathered this particular information, we also watched people work. And we discovered that there was a division of labor, that women had certain kinds of tasks and men had other kinds of tasks. And we could begin to comprehend the various activities that they had during the day. The women would spend some time in the fields, then they would have to come back from the fields, they'd have to pound the corn, and then they would have to cook the meals. So it was a great deal of work that was part of the women's routine as they went to work day in and day out. The men also had their routines in their work. And so as we did our walking tour of these places, we would see the men and the women engaged in their different activities. So you don't have to interview anyone. You see it with your eyes. It's part of your experience as you walk through this place, visiting from place to place. As we continued our work, I was interested in knowing the relationships between the people in these places. And so as I walked through this one quarter where Benjamin was from, and he told me the names of the people house to house, then it became important to build a genealogy to find out how those people were related to each other. So we stopped at this man's house, and we sat down and we began to ask him some questions. And he told us who his brothers were, who their children were, and who his father was and who his grandfather was, and we gathered this information. As we gathered this, I began to see the names that we had gotten on our household census were now appearing on my genealogies. And I could begin to trace the linkages of what we saw in space with what was going on in the minds of the people as they knew their relationships to one another. But with the selected genealogies, we discovered that in that particular quarter, that the lineage was divided up into sections. I mean, this big land section, you look down over these mountainous hills, there's farming all across this land. And so as we traveled through this place and we went from compound to compound, we discovered that there was an organizational structure. The lineages were grouped. In this particular place, there were 4 subdivisions within the big quarter. And each one of those subdivisions we would call a major lineage. A major lineage means that it was a group of men who were related to each other by some ancestor who had died away in the past. Within those 4 quarters, there were other segments of family. We called those minor lineages. In other words, they were groups of men who were related to one man who had died. And all the living men were brothers. And so if we think about the case that James has been working with us on in the last few weeks, we have Mbuva, who is James's father. Mbuva has brothers living around. But at this particular time, Mbuva's father is gone, right? Yes. But all those brothers are still know their father. They're related to one another. They would constitute here what we call a minor lineage. The major lineage would have a more distant ancestor and incorporate a larger number of people. Whereas the maximal lineage, in this particular case, would be, in this Cameroon setting, it was a quarter. The quarter was the maximal lineage. The town, they called, this particular town was called the Mbem clan. Okay. So this whole town of 5,000 people made up one clan. It was different from the kind of case that James shared with us earlier. In this particular town, it was one group of people lived there. They were all of the Mbem clan. But within that clan, there were 12 quarters, or what we call maximal lineages. And within those maximal lineages, you had then people who were the headmen. The man with the umbrella standing in the picture is the chief of this particular major lineage that we're looking at. He is the one who is actually, he was also the chief of the maximal lineage. He was the chief of 2 sections because they rotate the maximal lineage chieftainship between each one of the major lineages. And so at this particular time, he is the head of his major lineage. He's also head of the maximal lineage called Mbui, and it had a name. So they actually had a category for it. So as we went through this territory, this organization began to unfold. It was an organization based upon kinship. It was based upon their understanding of their relationships with one another. Now, the maximal lineages were joined together into these 12 groups. They formed a council of maximal lineage heads. And the man that you see here is the head man of one of those maximal lineages, and he's also the head of the council. He is the village chief. He is the chief of the clan of Mbem. And he has on his chiefly regalia. He's sitting on his chiefly stool, and he is speaking in the position of his authority at that particular point. You know, I happen to be his guest, and he's telling me a little bit about the situation there. Right next to him, kneeling down on the ground, is a diviner, a man who is one of the religious specialists in the village who has the methodology to divine whether or not the ancestors are angry because somebody did something wrong. For example, a child is sick, the child isn't getting better, the diviner would then try to find out why the child is ill. And so this man is a diviner, and he has his divining chips actually laid out on the ground there, and he's going through those to determine whether or not this, you know, he's just showing me what he would do. James.
The one finger that is lifting up signifies authority.
Okay. The one finger that he's lifting up signifies authority. Excellent. That's all the way off in West Africa, the same in East Africa.
Yes.
Okay, good. The other young man behind with the light-colored shirt on is well-educated. He works for the government in that area, and he's, excuse me, he serves as the chief's assistant for the traditional matters of the village. So you have the combination, interesting in this situation, of people that are well-educated. Some of them even have college degrees, and then those who come from the elders, usually who, maybe this chief has no education at all, and sometimes the young people didn't have much respect for him. They said he was ignorant and didn't know anything and just acted big. But that happens here too. That's what the students say about me at Biola. So, you know, it's part of the process of elder-younger differences.
His credentials are culminated in his long life experience. And that itself is a knockout to a Nairobi University degree.
Okay, long life experience qualifies much higher than a Nairobi University degree. All right. Some of the young people here didn't think that was true, but perhaps this chief drank too much palm wine. I don't know. At any rate, the lineages also are important in terms of marriage. All the women in this household are, I should say, the women married into this household do not come from this lineage. In fact, you cannot marry somebody from your own quarter. Now, in this particular village, you could not marry someone from your quarter. You could not marry someone from your mother's quarter. And you could not marry someone from your father's mother's quarter. Okay? So there were 3 quarters in the village that you could not marry. If you're a young man, you could not marry a woman from the quarter that you were born in. You could not marry a woman from the quarter that your mother was born in. And you could not marry a woman from the quarter that your father's mother was born in. Now there are 9 more. Okay? The village has 12 quarters. So you could marry in any of the other 9 quarters. So with this particular community, you could marry somebody in your clan, but you could not marry somebody from your quarter or your maximal lineage. And that's basically how their organization was structured. So as we looked into this, say, well, what does this have to do with the Bible Translation Committee? And why am I asking these questions? And how is this related to what people do and why they do it? Well, one of the things we discovered was that this structure, clan and lineage, created identities for people. And the churches were resisting the translation project because they said the Mbem clan is trying to glorify its own dialect. Okay? Now, language, clans, this clan, 5,000 people, had its own dialect. And the other villages were different clans. So it was really like what James had described. All the people going to this church are from the same clan. Big clan, 5,000 people. The next church over the mountain has another clan, and over the next mountain another clan, and those people are saying, these Mbem people, they want to do the Bible translation. They're just doing it in their own language, and they're trying to glorify their own clan. So in understanding these ethnic, or I should say clan rivalries, it helps you to understand why some of the churches may not be supporting the translation project. And how do you then address that issue of dialect difference and the notion of rivalry between these clans and how they should cooperate together? This is an important problem. And it was something that, until we understood the clan structure, we didn't really recognize that the local churches were having disagreements that fell out on traditional clan lines. All right, let's go on. The problem focus, again, comes down to the church and the Bible Translation Project. We're there not because we want to know the traditional social organization. We're there to understand why the churches are not supporting the Bible Translation Project. And so as we look at that, we're trying to focus then on what will help us to gain the understanding that we need. As we went further on this, the most important group of people to start with is the Bible Translation Committee themselves. What are you doing? How are you doing it? What have you asked the people to do? And as I watched this clan work, it was interesting because they structured themselves just like, I watched this committee work, they structured themselves just like church committees in America or Canada. The particular mission in this place was North American Baptist. Most of the missionaries had come from either the northern part of the United States or southern part of Canada. And they came over there with church structure that was familiar to them from America. So the church had the same kind of Baptist organization that the church in America had. The church had the same kind of committees that the North American churches had. And this Bible Translation Committee was organized with the president, a vice president, and a secretary-treasurer. Now, that in itself, no surprise. You know, they operated on parliamentary procedure. I watched their committee meeting, however, and it was fascinating. They opened the meeting, had the minutes of the last meeting read, and then they had a big argument about the minutes. And as they argued about some particular item in the minutes, they went on and on and on and discussed this item. What in the world are they arguing about? Well, It had something to do with the participation of a particular church in the last committee meeting. And the man who was discussing this was saying that that was not accurate, that it hadn't happened that way. And so they had this long discussion until they finally agreed on this. Now, if this had happened in America, somebody had said, call a question, call a question. We don't want to have this discussion. Let's just get on with the business. But no, they discussed this whole thing for half an hour until they could come to some consensus about what happened in that last meeting, change the minutes to reflect that consensus, and then they had to vote to approve the minutes. Well, by that time they had consensus, the vote was unnecessary. And what I discovered was that they really didn't use parliamentary procedure at all. It was a veneer. It went at the beginning and it went at the end. In the middle, they used consensus, discussion, and decision-making, which is what they'd always done in their traditional culture and society. So they'd adapted an external form, but what was going on underneath was really the way they work. Well, that gave me a clue as to what some of the issues were with regard to the whole project. Because there were a lot of external forms that were being used, and there was a lot of discontinuity between the way things actually worked in the community and the external forms that were part of their work. As we looked at the translation committee, then they became a key focus for our work. And as I note on page 41 in your outline, we interviewed each committee member with a formal questionnaire. We interviewed the non-members regarding the contribution of the committee to the local church. We observed meetings and a party in which committee members entertained us. We interviewed outsiders, including the SIL personnel, with regard to their opinion as to the effectiveness of the committee. Now, all of this was important in terms of giving us a sense of how the committee were relating in the community. And these were fine men. Some of them were pastors, some of them were lay people. They were working together in this project. They were really committed to it. They wanted it to happen. But there were some issues that were of creating tension for them. We also participated in local church activities. I attended the services in the Mbem Central Church. The actual quarter that I went to had a small church up on the hill. People from the same clan, but it was too far to walk all the way down into the Mbem main church, and so they'd put a church up on top of the mountain, which was kind of at their little marketplace outside of the main Mbem market, and that was a place then, kind of a second central place in the Mbem community. But in each of these places, we met people, we interviewed them, and one of the things that we were interested in doing is finding out what they were interested in reading. Because Bible translation is about reading. It's about having the Bible in their own language. And so we wanted to find, what do you already read? If you had something in your own language, would you read it? And we discovered that they had geography books. They had history books, that they really liked geography and history. In fact, the guy that I ate with, he was just astonished that I was so ignorant about African geography. And finally one day he said to me, didn't they teach you anything in school? Yes. And I said, well, not much about Africa, you know. And it was really true. I mean, he knew far more of the details about Africa. And he was asking me about things happening in Brazzaville. I didn't even know where that was. And telling me about something happening down in Harare, and I didn't know where Harare was. I didn't even know what he was talking about. You know, all of these kinds of things were part of my ignorance, but he was very knowledgeable about these things and was able to discuss these things very intelligently. So it was really an interesting experience to begin to explore what people were interested in reading, what kind of things that they enjoyed. And I soon discovered out of this, I was trying to find out what they would be motivated on in terms of literacy. The two key things they really wanted was a songbook in their own language, and they wanted a calendar in their own language that they could use for day calendar work. So they also were interested in things having to do with their marketing activities, being able to keep records for buying and selling, and I'll come back to that. Well, another thing that I chanced upon, another thing that I did when I was there is I discussed with the SIL people their view of the committee. And one of the things I discovered from these interviews out in the community and the interviews with the SIL people was that there were problems about handling money. This became a big issue. The people in the community said, well, you know, we don't trust Pastor so-and-so. He is just using the money for things that we don't think are right. I said, well, what are you accusing him of? And they say, well, he has his motorbike, and he's out, and he needs gas. And so the money from the committee goes to support his gas instead of for the Bible translation work. And it's fine if he needs gas, but he shouldn't be using the committee money for the gas. Then, you know, he's a secretary and he's a treasurer. And so there's no accountability. You know, who's going to know if he's kept the records properly or not? And then even the SIL people, they said, well, you know, we're paying him by the hour, but he's not producing the translation work. And, you know, we're getting frustrated with that. He's getting this pay, but nothing is happening. And we want to see things happening. So there were some financial issues that were going on. And these complaints, I heard them, but I didn't have a context in which to understand them. And when you're in a situation like this, one of the things that you're doing is you're learning everything you can, not knowing what counts. Because you never know what's going to be important. I mean, I did this clan and lineage stuff just because it's fun, you know. And I wanted to know. I wanted to know how people were related. I wanted to figure out what was going on, what their structure was. But once I'd learned it, and then I began to get into people's frustrations about this committee work, I began to connect their frustration with the clan structure. I began to connect their frustration with the way money was handled, and I began to ask, okay, what's going on behind this? And so in digging deeper into this, again, I had wonderful opportunities to explore it. In our survey, going from place to place, and Dan was my colleague working with me, we visited people, we talked to them about their reading habits, and then we just sit and talk about anything else, you know. And we'd come around, well, what do you think of this committee? And how are they doing? And what things are you frustrated about? What don't you like? And over again, we would say, well, they're good people, and they're doing their work, but we're not happy with how they're handling the money. So we tried to figure out what was behind that. Well, while I was there, I discovered that the women working in the market would make money. I mean, they bring their crops to the market. You know, you dig out your yams and you take them in the marketplace, you sell them. You bake some donuts or bread, and you bring that to the market and you sell it. And so the women are working hard. They're producing things, they're bringing it to the market, making their own money. And the marketplace is a very important place where they gather to meet, to talk, and also to sell their goods. Well, when they have the money, what do they do with it? There are no banks. You can't invest it for interest. And so what they'd done is they created these saving societies. Now, they were voluntary societies. And as we talked to people, just small talk, we discovered that, hey, they were saving their money. So I said, well, how's this work? And they said, well, we don't like to talk about it. And so I said, well, why not? You know, well, it's secret. Yes. And so being an anthropologist, I got to find out what's secret. You know, I'm really into this. Okay, there's something going on here I need to know. Well, the reason it was secret is because there are no banks. And so somebody has the money, but they don't want anybody else to know who has it. And I discovered that the man that I was eating with every day was the secretary of a savings society. So about the end of the first week, I said, would you let me see the books? I said, oh, no. He said, oh, no, I can't let you see the books. No, I'd have to get permission from the group to do that, and I can't let you see the books. After 2 weeks of eating with him, he not only let me see the books, he let me copy the information out of the books to understand what was going on in the group, because we built a relationship. Now, why did I want the information? Well, I was interested in the dynamics of how these things worked. And I don't have pictures of this, but I can tell you that I observed one day a savings society group. I couldn't take pictures because they wouldn't let me. We walked on this long path, and we ended way, way out in the middle of nowhere, and there was a house out there. And as we got close to the house, we kind of ducked back into the trees and kind of crept along through the trees so people wouldn't see us going to the house. When I got to the house, the man who was taking me said, now you have to wait here. I have to go in and make sure that it's all right to bring you in. He went inside, and I waited a little bit, and he came back out and said, yeah, you can come in. They've given their approval. So I come into this house, and I sit down, and it's dark inside because there are no lights, there's no electricity, and it's a traditional house, but it's a big one. And I began to look around, and I count. There are 30 people sitting in this house in a big circle around the room on chairs. And right in the middle of the house, there is a small table, and there are 2 men sitting at that table, and there's another man standing next to it who greets me. And he welcomes me to this place, and he's the president. And he said, we're happy that you've come to our meeting. Please don't tell anybody else where it is. Please don't say anything about who we are. And I assured him I didn't know anybody's name and wouldn't be asking anybody's name, and that I couldn't remember even if they did tell me. I didn't take notes, because in that case it was very clear that I was privileged to be in this place, but they didn't want any record of anything that was going on here. So the record is all up here. I remember. Now, as we sat there, it was very interesting to watch what happened. The president said, "Is there anybody here that would like to save money?" And so we'll say Larry came forward and says, "Yes, I have 50,000 Central African francs, and I'd like to put this in for savings today." And so Larry would come up to that table in the center, and he would count it out, 50,000 Central African francs. And then a man sitting at the table would pick up the money, and he would count it out, 50,000 Central African francs. Then the treasurer would come over, pick up the money, and he would count it out, 50,000 Central African francs. Now everybody, 30 people in the room, have seen the treasurer take 50,000 Central African francs. The man sitting at the table, the other man sitting at the table is the secretary. He never touches the money. He writes in the book, "Larry has given us 50,000 Central African francs." And we go through that with everybody that wants to save money. When they're all finished saving money, then anybody here that wants to borrow money? And Faith comes up and she says, "I'd like to borrow 30,000 Central African francs. I want to use that for my daughter's schooling." And so they said, "Well, we have to investigate her character. And so let's select a committee here, and we'll select James, and we'll select Annie, and we'll select Marcy, and they're going to go outside, and they're going to tell us, evaluate, do you know her well enough to evaluate her character?" And they say, "Well, yeah, we do." So they go out and have a discussion. And they come back in and they say, "We're sorry, Faith, but you don't qualify. The last loan that you had, you didn't pay back soon enough. The only way that we'll give you this money is if you have a guarantee. Is there anybody in the room who will guarantee Faith's loan?" And Julie raised her hand and says, "I'll guarantee it." Okay? We have to have a committee. So James and Larry and James go back out and tell us, is Julie reliable? Is she a good guarantee? They have a discussion. Okay? After they come back in, they say, "Julie's a good guarantee. You can give Faith the loan. If Faith doesn't pay it back, Julie will guarantee it, and she'll pay it." Now, that's the process they went through. I was there for 2 hours. And at the end of that 2 hours, it was very clear to me why nobody had any confidence in the Bible Translation Committee. You know, the Bible Translation Committee had a secretary-treasurer, one man who had the money and who kept it in his house and who kept the records. And they would never trust any. They wouldn't even let the secretary touch the money in their savings society. I mean, the secretary didn't do anything but keep the books. And the treasurer, nobody was even allowed to know what the treasurer's name was for fear that somebody would come and steal the money out of his house, because there was no place else to put it. In other words, and if it wasn't loaned out in the meeting, then the treasurer would take it home and they would loan it to the next meeting 2 weeks later, because they saved the money to loan it because they got 10% interest in 6 weeks. You know, very good turnaround here in terms of profit. But it was one of those things where the whole process was one that required absolute public counting, public record keeping, and public integrity. Well, at that particular point, it was just so clear to me that no wonder people didn't trust the committee, and no wonder after the initial set of gifts to this project, the gifts stopped. And the churches weren't giving anymore. They weren't giving because they saw this as a project to glorify the Mbem clan, and they weren't giving because they saw that those guys in the Mbem clan weren't accountable with their money. They weren't using it in a way that they all would expect in terms of accountability. And so the process was one that basically undermined their credibility within the community. Well, I came back and I said to the pastors, I said, you know, if you really want to have respectability in your community, you have to use your own system. Forget this Baptist system. It's not going to work here. You have to use the system that you use in the saving societies for accountability. Now, a postscript on this story. The pastor who was the secretary-treasurer did not want to change this. You know, he was basically wanted access to the money without accountability. And so as a consequence, it wasn't changed. He resisted the change. And so the community didn't support the project. Now, one of the things that happened is that the SIL team, another thing that happened is I went to the market, which was the last slide that I showed you, and in looking at that, I saw that nobody gets paid by the hour. They all get paid by what they produce. If you produce potatoes and sell them, you get paid. And if you don't sell them, you don't get paid. If you produce bread, you sell it, you get paid. So why get paid if you don't produce anything? Nobody else does. And so I suggested, instead of paying the man by the hour, pay him by the verse. Well, then we'll get bad quality verses. Well, it's better to have a bad quality verse than no verse at all, isn't it? And so they switched to paying by the verse, and all of a sudden they had verses. They had text coming in that the product that they were looking for. And this was not uncommon. This is exactly the way the whole system worked. In other words, you got paid for what was produced in that context. So as we look at this particular research project, it wasn't really an earth-shaking project. But there were basically some fundamental things that were obstacles to getting the work done. And they were things that were part of cultural miscommunication, part of personal sin, perhaps, and accountability in the lives of people. I mean, you always have to recognize that we, at heart, are people in the flesh. And in the flesh, we sometimes are tempted to do things that we shouldn't do in the spirit. And so in this context, you have Christian people who have a system that allows them to act in the flesh and doesn't keep them accountable. And so this particular man was not accountable. And he acted in the flesh and basically resisted the change that would have provided the accountability for the committee.
The other major problem that they faced was this man already had an office. He is a pastor. And being a pastor and being a secretary and being a treasurer is taking jobs that could be done by the members of the community. In East Africa, what we do is the pastor can be a chairman and lead the committee meeting, but he cannot touch money. He cannot be assigned money. Somebody else will be assigned money. Somebody else will be a secretary. And in that way, there is balance and accountability, as it were.
Amen. And that's really what this particular group needed. Well, I'm just going to review this for you quickly now and just kind of give you an overview. I've told you the outcome of this project. There were some solutions that actually were able to be used by the team there, and the project did go more smoothly. The committee did get some support because they did do a songbook. They did do the journal and the calendar that people wanted, and those things sparked interest in the community, and they were able to sell them, and it increased literacy in their language, and they ultimately finished the New Testament. But in doing this, this little research project provided some breakthroughs that were helpful in terms of getting the work done. As we look at it, we did do some documentary research to help us. There was an ethnography written on the Yamba people. I read it. And that provided some good background. From the ethnography, from this previous research done by another anthropologist several years before, I had a description of the clan system. And so going out on the ground and actually seeing it and working with it, I was able then to verify that his observations were accurate. We could see how it worked. We could understand its practice, and we could do it in a short period of time. So having some background makes it not so difficult to decipher everything that's going on there. You have something to start with. We also had committee notes and publications. The committee kept their records. We had some of the things that they'd published, and so we could see some of the work that they'd done. You always use the resources that are available to you when you go into a community. You learn from the kind of resources they have there. The record book of the Savings Society was a marvelous tool for me because it helped me to see how many people were participating in this, how they were saving, and how careful the records were kept. That's really what I was interested in seeing, is the accuracy of the records and the importance of the secretary's work in terms of providing accountability. It was just so obvious from that that here was a major component in the culture that ensured financial accountability, and it wasn't being used by the church. With regard to the methodology that we used in this situation, there are a number of things that I just want to suggest to you as an overview that might be useful as you think about your project. First of all, I want to say that you can't do research without strategy. You have to have some particular focus in mind. Sometimes people think that participant observation is just going into a community and participating and observing. But that's false. That's really not what's happening at all. What you want to do is you want to say, okay, what are the key issues that I'm about here. If I go into this community, what do I want to accomplish? The issue that I've given you for your project is to say, I want to lead this person to Christ. So if you take that as an issue, then what can I learn about this person and their relationships that would help me lead them to Christ and help me lead their friends to Christ? Now you could say, hey, I want to broaden that project. I want to know a little bit more about this person's network of people. You might say, I want to see how to network through this person to other people. You might say, I'm interested in family problems, and I want to know how this person's problems are related to the problems of their parents and their grandparents and to their siblings. And so I'm interested in how the problematic behavior of a particular individual has roots in terms of their family history. So anything like that, having a strategy is very important, because if you can identify up front what your specific interest is and the question you ultimately want to come out with, then you design your project around that. We knew that we were looking at the effectiveness of the translation committee. So everything we did ultimately came back to that question. Why is this committee having problems? Now, I did a lot of things that on the surface didn't seem to have any relationship to them. Number one, they helped me build relationships, because what I found was if I went directly into the issue of money, people wouldn't talk to me. At the end of the first week, my host wouldn't let me look at the books. But by the end of the second week, our relationship had become so warm, the books were open to me. I could even copy things out of the books. So you see, the relationship is really important. And a lot of the things that I learned I didn't use, but they were valuable to me in building relationship. For example, we talked about marriage. I haven't even discussed marriage tonight with you, because that's next week's topic, and we'll be interviewing James on his marriage next week. But marriage was a wonderful discussion for us, because I told him all about my getting married, about my father-in-law, about my father and mother, about my wife and our families and how we did these things and who was involved in our marriage. Then he told me all about his. And he said, what'd you have to pay for your wife? I said, well, she paid for the wedding. He said, what? And, I said, well, that's our custom, The wife's family has to pay for the wedding. I have to provide the apartment afterwards, but they have to pay for the wedding. Oh, my, he said, boy, you get off easy. And he said, I'm still paying for my wife, and I've got 4 children. And so then we went on and discussed this process. And he said every time he sees his father-in-law, he's got more payment to make in terms of the marriage relationship, because the custom there is that the husband pays for about 20 years. In fact, he says, I keep paying till my father-in-law dies. And so every time he goes to his father-in-law's home, there's more that he has to give. So it was really interesting to explore this, to understand it, to begin to see the dynamic relationship going on between those people. Okay, as we look at this, we're also looking at the conceptual designs that are part of the people that we're working with. In thinking about this, one of the things I say in the notes is culture is personable, and designs are multiple. I think it's important to understand this, that every individual in a culture has their idea of how it works, and they're not all the same. In other words, just like you and I are different, they are different. And it doesn't make any difference what culture you go to in the world. What I have learned is that people argue about their own culture. They say, well, this is the way it is. And somebody says, no, it's that way. And there is this ongoing discussion between people. Now, there are broad issues about which they have consensus. It's true of us in our churches, broad issues about which we have consensus. But if you talk about the interpretation of any specific text, probably 2 or 3 people disagree with what this text actually means in the Scripture. And so as we look at conceptual designs of a culture, what you're looking for is what do they have consensus about, and what are the things about which they disagree. And so in this kind of thing, you basically then recognize there's this diversity. For our project, we limited our research to the people who had some knowledge about the things we were really concerned about. There are all kinds of people to work with there, but the most important people were those on the translation committee and those church leaders who could provide commentary for us on why they weren't supporting the project. Fortunately, while we were there, they had a little conference in the church, and the church leaders from other places came around. It was a Bible conference, so we had a chance to talk to other pastors. And we said, well, isn't your church giving money anymore to support the translation project? And that's where we got the kind of information that I've shared with you. The fourth thing we look at here is what I call the behavioral situation. In this, pattern must be abstracted from situations, yet they're never applied in the abstract. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is this, that people treat each situation as a unique event, but they are in some ways predictable about what they do. So for example, every day I would go to the market. It would be different than it was the day before, but there would be a lot of things that would be the same. I could expect that they would be there around 4 o'clock. I could expect that some of the same guys would show up every day, but every day it varied. And so you would have 2 or 3 men one day, one of those would be missing the next day, another would be missing the third day. It was kind of, ebb and flow, but there were patterns, and yet they are always concrete in terms of how they're worked out. And as we looked at this thing, event analysis was an important part of what we were doing. In other words, we wanted to understand the committee meeting. We wanted to understand the party. We wanted to understand the church service. We understand the Bible conference. All of these things gave us some understanding of what people did. For me, the moment of just complete revelation was the Saving Society meeting. When I walked into that meeting and I actually saw what happened, I thought, man, I don't need to ask any more questions. That was the defining moment, because it was just one of those times when I just saw it with my very eyes. Here's how they handle money. Now, there had to be trust for me to get in that meeting. It took me 2 weeks to earn the credibility by eating with people, by talking with them, by telling them my stories, by just being available, and then they're trusting me, they allowed me into that place. So that whatever else I did, even if it was irrelevant to the project, it built trust and got me into that one defining event, which was really critical. The survey was also a helpful part of this process, because we did some basic questionnaires on literacy and understood what people were doing there. I want to just take a minute and tell you a story before I go on to the concluding quick overview of the procedures that we've had here. The Lord actually gave me a wonderful moment in that Saving Society meeting, which was utterly out of my plan. Sometime earlier that day, somebody had given me 2 kola nuts. Now, kola nuts are about this big around. They're almost the size of a kiwi. They're a little bit like coffee. You chew them, and it provides caffeine and basically a little bit of a stimulant for people. And people like to chew them. Well, I'd never chewed kola nuts before. I didn't know what to do with kola nuts. I had them in my pocket. And I'm sitting in this Saving Society meeting, and I stick my hand in my pocket. I think, oh, this is a good place to get rid of these things. So I take them out of my pocket. I hand them to the man who had brought me. And I said, here, have these and share them with anybody who'd like to have them. And so he took them. He gave them to the president. The president cut them all up into small pieces, and everybody around got a piece of kola nut. And then we all chewed kola nut. And I had no idea that I'd done anything good. And, I'd gotten rid of these kola nuts. And, I felt, well, good, I had maybe thrown them away, so here it was a good place to use them. When we came out of the meeting, my friend said to me, I just couldn't believe that you did that. I said, what? He said, those kola nuts. He said, that was wonderful. That was just so wonderful. I just couldn't believe that you did that. He said, that was the best thing you could have possibly done. And I said, God is merciful, because it was not my intent. But I learned something there, that giving is so important, and that having something to give is important. That had been given to me, and I would have thrown it away. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to use it. But by God's grace, I had at least the will to take it out of my pocket. Now, I won't say wisdom, because it wasn't wisdom. I at least had the will to take it out and give it. And it was such a blessing to those people, and it was a blessing to the man that brought me, because he had risked himself in taking me into that meeting. In asking permission, he was violating the rules. Yes. By bringing a stranger in, that was something that was not acceptable. And then when I gave the cola nuts, I just blessed everybody there with that event and expressed my appreciation. I didn't even know I was doing it. So God is gracious and God is merciful to us. And that was a moment that I'll never forget, because what I learned out of that was that it's always important to think and ask, how can I give? And how can I show my expression of appreciation in this context? Okay, briefly, summary. Prepare a map. As you look at the things that you're going to do, you need to have those maps that James and I have been using for the last 3 weeks. Complete a census. That's just getting the names of people so that you can begin to know them by name and know their relationships. The genealogies, you take the genealogy, you put it on top of the census, and you begin to look at how those people that you've learned to know by going to their houses are connected to each other. You superimpose the genealogies over the map, if you will. You have the map, you look at the genealogy, see how the people on the map are connected together. James actually did that for us on the map he had up here. He went through it and he said, oh, this is my father's brother and this is my mother's relative and, you know, these people are related to me. He took that map and he connected you to all the people that are there. Documenting the marriage is an important part of this process that we really didn't talk about tonight. But marriages, if you remember what James said, we go to this market because that's where we meet my mother's relatives. And that's a very important time for us to go there and make that connection. And so as you look at that process, you basically see how things work in that framework. Okay, my computer, I guess, is going to, okay, identify leadership roles. In looking at the leadership roles, you want to see who are the key people in the community and how do they work with one another. The analysis process is one that you're looking at the particular kind of interest that people have and how they relate to one another. How do they pursue interest? That's an important issue. What are the ones that are important? Remember, the Saving Society is really key in this because that demonstrates very important interest. Observation and interview are basic techniques that you can use to sharpen your understanding of what's going on in this place. I had heard a lot of talk about saving societies, but being there and seeing it, just the light turned on. I saw things that I would not have seen before. And then follow-up interviews afterwards is important. Examining political events is an important part of the society. And in this situation, some of the political events were the meetings of the Bible Translation Committee. But these are some of the ways in which you can dig deeper into the framework, understand better what people are doing, and come out with an understanding of what's in their minds and how they see their world, and then know how to work with them and be partnering together to accomplish the goals that God has given to you in that place. Okay, with that, we will close.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.